All right, so this week we're talking about biodiversity and evolution some more. This is part 2 of this segment. Biodiversity and evolution starts in chapter 4 in the book, so we'll finish off where we left off last week in chapter 4, and then move into community ecology in chapter 7. Okay, so last week we left off with big idea number 3, that geological processes like volcanoes, earthquakes, plate tectonics in general have changed the Earth, and as a result, they've created new opportunities for the evolution of species. The first big idea this week is that human activities are decreasing biodiversity on our planet. And we've talked about this quite a bit, and the fact that we're in a mass extinction event as a result of human activities. So you can see human activities like here, where we're looking at urban sprawl, where we've cut down natural ecosystems and created our own housing units. And then over here, this is not a dog swimming, this is indeed a polar bear, and we've heard a little bit about the melting ice caps and how polar bears have less space to hang out. So quick review, what is a species? A species is a group of the same type of organism that can breed with each other and produce fertile offspring, okay? So we have these really cute ferrets right here. These two breed together. They're this same species here, and they get their little offspring. One looks like mom or dad, and the other one looks like mom or dad. I'm not sure which is which there. Then we have these elk and a horse up here. Obviously, the elk here are a species, and the horse is a different species. These two cannot interbreed, therefore they're not the same type of organism. All right, so the question is, how do we get new species? The formation of new species is known as speciation, all right? And it's not something that happens super quickly. So here is a wild boar, species A, and over time with certain pressures, maybe the geologic changes or climate change, species A develops new characteristics and traits, and over time becomes species B, all right? So species A becomes species B, evolves to species B, but species A may still exist, and if we tried to interbreed species B with species A, it wouldn't work, and they wouldn't have fertile offspring, all right? Another way is that species A gets separated from the rest of its species. Maybe the plate tectonics over a long period of time pulled apart two continents or created a mountain range in between these two species A, and over time this species evolved from its original ancestors of species A. When brought back together, species C and species A would also not be able to interbreed. So speciation, the formation of new species, can happen in a bunch of different ways. All right, so there are several different plausible models for how speciation might occur. Of course, it's really hard for scientists to get a really good eyewitness account of any of these natural speciation events, since most of the time these events happen or happened a long time ago, or happen over such a long period of time. All right, so instead of being an eyewitness to speciation, what we can do is look at two similar species, the northern spotted owl and the Mexican spotted owl, with different ranges. The northern spotted owl lives up here in the northwest, the Mexican spotted owl down here in Mexico in the Four Corners region of the southwest, and say we know these have a common ancestor. So what happened? How did they become separate species? And one common model for this is called geographic isolation. So members of a population are physically separated. You can see here these two populations are physically separated, and they can be separated for a bunch of different reasons, either due to migration, mountain ranges forming, roads getting in the way. So they're isolated now. Let's say this is as a result of the Rocky Mountain Range isolating these two populations, and over time they become absolutely separate species. You can see here the northern spotted owl, totally different species name here than the Mexican spotted owl. So geographic isolation, so common ancestor here, we get the same species here, and then they're isolated, right? It can lead to reproductive isolation. So here, these flies here, one group is fed starch food, the other maltose food, and over time, due to their diets, they actually have new characteristics. So here, the flies look the same, but they're fed different foods. And then, as this is fed maltose food, these flies become yellow in color, all right? And these flies maintain a red coloring because of their starch diet. The same could be true of the northern spotted owl. When it was just the spotted owl, before it became the northern spotted owl, and it got isolated geographically from the rest of its population down in Mexico, it likely ended up eating a different diet in its new surroundings in the Northwest. And as it ate that different diet, just similar to these yellow flies and these red flies, the two species, northern spotted owl eating one diet, Mexican spotted owl eating a different diet, became separate, geographically isolated species. Okay, so just like these yellow flies here and the red flies here, when brought back together, only the yellow flies will mate or breed with each other, and the red flies will breed with each other. They will not interbreed. Thus, they are reproductively isolated, they don't produce fertile offspring, and hence they are different species. And now we know the northern spotted owl and the Mexican spotted owl, too, are different species. Geographic isolation led them to reproductive isolation. Reproductive isolation takes a really long time. In fast-breeding organisms, where the gestation is really short period of time, gestation meaning from the time they get pregnant to the time they have new offspring. In these possums here, you can see it's 12 to 13 days, and they have many births a year. Whereas in an elephant population here, gestation is a couple years, and so they have a birth every 5 years or so. In which case, because it's super slow breeding time, these organisms take a lot longer to see different characteristics and traits than these organisms that have many offspring or many births a year, in which case the turnaround time within their generations is really fast. These generations take much longer. All right, so in that case, if we were to separate elephants with geographic isolation from each other over hundreds of years, and then we brought them back together, chances are they're still similar enough in species that they would still be able to interbreed. They wouldn't be reproductively isolated. If you separated possums into two different groups and you took them apart for 100 years or so, likely is that they've had so many generations in between that they've developed new characteristics that make them completely separate species, and therefore reproductive isolation occurs at a much faster pace. Unfortunately, for some species of animals, some populations, they're unable to adapt to their changing environmental conditions fast enough, so unable to evolve certain traits by natural selection from generation to generation. And as a result, if they're unable to evolve quick enough, the species will cease to exist, hence become extinct. This happened to the Tasmanian tiger here. It was overhunted, unable to blend into its environment fast enough and somehow defend itself from humans, and it was overhunted in the 1930s. This happens to be one of the animals that they're talking about making de-extinct, and maybe if we do that for our current event next week, we'll learn a little bit about the Tasmanian tiger. So who is most vulnerable to extinction? What types of populations of animals? There are a type of populations that are called endemic species, and those are species that are only found in one place. So animals such as the northern spotted owl, found in a really limited range here in the Northwest, and also those that are resource specialist species. So they eat a really limited food supply, so very specific things, and they live in only one type of habitat. All right, so all of these animals here are either endemic to a certain area, meaning they only live there, or they're very specialist species eating a very limited amount of or type of food. In either of these cases, if their surroundings change, for instance, if their one habitat, this one place that they live changes, there are no other populations around the world for them to survive as a species, in which case, if the conditions change faster than they can adapt, that entire species will go extinct because it's only located in that one spot. As resource specialist species, if they eat a limited food supply and that particular type of food that they eat changes, then they have no other option for food, in which case they would go extinct as well. So let's be real, animals do go extinct. It's a pattern that we've seen throughout history. Background extinction is the low rate of species extinction that occurs throughout time, and on average, we lose about 1 to 5 species per million per year. So does it really matter if we have species going extinct? So why should we care? Well, The background extinction rates, like we talked about before, are primarily low on the planet, somewhere, a couple species per million per year. And every now and then, it's hypothesized that there have been 5 of these, actually, known as mass extinction events. And that's where there's a widespread and rapid decrease in the amount of life on Earth as a result of some catastrophic event. So, like I said, there's been about 5 of these mass extinctions events in the past as a result of meteorites, widespread fire, things like this. We're likely in the 6th mass extinction event, and we look at the number of species that we're decreasing by per year. Unfortunately for us, and for species across the globe, this particular mass extinction event is likely a result of human activities, whether it be habitat destruction, global climate change, and other factors as a result of human activities. How does species extinction have to do with biodiversity? Well, when a species goes extinct, it opens a new habitat and resources for other species. So if an animal is eating a specific other animal or specific plant, when it goes extinct, it opens up that niche or those animals and those plants to other species, and possibly that will lead to the formation of a new species. All right, so we know that our big idea number 4 was that humans decrease biodiversity. So the first quick thing having to do with that big idea is, how would you respond to someone that says that because extinction is a natural process, we've seen this extinction happening throughout the years, that we should not worry when a species becomes endangered due to our activities? Respond to that on a separate sheet of paper. I'll collect the quick thinks next Tuesday. All right, big idea number 5, biodiversity increases the sustainability of ecosystems. So the more diverse the plants and animals within an ecosystem, the more sustainable that ecosystem is. All right, so there are 2 ways in which we measure species diversity. The first is species richness. So that's the number of different types of species in an ecosystem. The second is species evenness, which is the relative abundance of each of those different types of species. Okay, I want to use a pretty simple example to explain the difference between richness and evenness. So when we're talking about richness, let's look at this. We have high school A has 1,000 students. High school B also has 1,000 students, all right? They have the same amount of richness in population. There are 3 different populations that we're looking at: white students, black students, and Hispanic students. Notice both have all 3 types of students, or populations of students. Now let's look at evenness. When we compare evenness, we look at the numbers, relatively numbers, in each of those populations. Notice high school A here has 350 white students, 400 black students, and 250 Hispanic students. Pretty even, right? Even in numbers. Not a lot of difference there. But we look at high school B. While they have the same richness as high school A, very different in richness. Here, or in evenness. Here we have 950 white students, only 20 black students, and only 30 Hispanic students. So the number of students in each of those populations is not even. And now let's do a little more real example here within 2 different biomes. In the tropical rainforest, there are tons of different species, 10,000 different species that we know of. But there are really relatively low numbers, or low numbers of each of these types. Then we have the deciduous forest here, with only a few dozen different species, but very high numbers of each one of those species. So in this case, we would say the tropical rainforest is far more rich than the deciduous forest, even though they have the number-wise fewer numbers of each of the species. So where are the most diverse places on the planet? And we've talked about this in biomes. It really varies with the geographic location where you're at. On average, there are far more plants and animals, different types of plants and animals near the equator. And as you go either north, or south to the poles, the species numbers decline. And we learned in our biomes presentations that the 4 most species-rich environments, so they have the most different types of species, are in the tropical rainforest, in coral reefs, on the ocean bottom, and also in large tropical lakes. So let's tie this into sustainability. In areas with high species richness, a lot of different things, they also have higher primary productivity, all right? And they tend to be more stable. So more plants support more consumers, more things that eat those plants. The more consumers and plants means the more connections amongst those consumers. As a reminder, primary productivity, net primary productivity, is the energy that's left over and available to consumers produced by plants. All right, then there's also islands, and islands come into play when we're talking about biodiversity because there's this theory of island biogeography. And up here, this is Edward O. Wilson. We've read some of his books. This is actually what I did my thesis on in college. The number of species on an island is determined by two things, right? The immigration rate, the number of things coming onto that island, and the extinction rate. Makes sense, all right? The closer you are to other areas, all right, will increase the number of things that are able to get there, so closeness, all right? And the larger the island will also increase the immigration rate, okay? So larger and closer islands determine the immigration and the extinction rate. A larger island has a less chance to become extinct, or species have a less chance to become extinct because of their ability to move across that island. Again, reviewing two things about the island that affect these rates. The size of the island. Smaller islands have less species because it is a smaller target out there for colonizers to come in. So they have a slower immigration, things moving onto the island. Smaller islands also have a higher extinction rate because there are fewer resources and less ecosystem diversity there for those species. And the second piece of island biogeography theory is the distance from the mainland. So the closer to the mainland tends to have higher immigration rates and thus more species. So why is this work important? It's important because we are creating islands when we develop land. So you can see here this plot was clear cut here, and it's an island amongst the forested areas. So scientists use this theory to determine how big the island needs to be to maintain biodiversity. There have been others who have thought of the Earth as an island, or as our national parks as islands of habitat for animals, especially those that are migrating long distances. So the question is, are these islands close enough to other islands and large enough to sustain life for those species? Okay, so our last big idea was that biodiversity increases sustainability of an ecosystem. So the quick thing for this is, if you could design a healthy, sustainable ecosystem, but you had to choose between high species richness, meaning the number of different species, and low evenness, meaning there were fewer species, or the opposite, where you have low species richness but high evenness, which would you choose and why? Again, you're putting this on a separate sheet of paper. All your quick think should be together, and you're going to turn those in on Tuesday. All right, big idea number 6. Each species plays a really important role in its ecosystem. We know this. So the role the species plays in the ecosystem is its ecological niche, and it includes everything that affects the survival of that species and its ability to reproduce. So it could be anything from water to the needs of sunlight, space requirements, temperature tolerance, food, and resource needs. So we know a polar bear isn't going to live down here in the Northwest, and a salmon probably isn't going to live, where wouldn't a salmon live? In freshwater lake, where it is unable to migrate. It wouldn't have all that it needs in order to survive. So salmon have a certain requirement for what they eat and the type of water they're in. They need to be able to migrate out to the ocean. All of those things make up its ecological niche, and thus the role it plays within that ecosystem. You don't want to confuse habitat, where a species lives, with the niche, which is the way it lives. Where habitat influences the niche of an animal, it doesn't describe it entirely. All right, so in addition to habitat features, a niche must also kind of reflect an organism's behaviors and any other external variables, such as temperature or wind, that could affect those behaviors. So an ecological niche is the very particular environment in which a species has evolved over time to live, and that's where it will be most successful. You might be wondering why understanding niches of species is important and why do these, what's their habitat versus what's their niche is important. And one is maybe scientific curiosity, just to know more about how the earth works. The other is to prevent premature extinction. If we learn very particular pieces within an ecosystem about where the niches are filled by different animals, we can learn more to help avoid premature extinction. And the other is to see and assess exactly the impact of human changes on both terrestrial and aquatic ecosystems. There are two main types of niches. There's the generalists, which have a very broad niche and can live in many places. They eat a variety of foods. They can tolerate a range of conditions. So examples of those are like mice, deer, raccoons, certainly humans, flies, crows. These are all generalists. And then there are the beautiful specialists. They have a very narrow niche and they only live in one type of habitat. They use one or just a few types of food. They tolerate small range of environmental conditions. So examples to these are things like the tiger salamander, giant pandas, flamingos, koalas, all eating specific things and living in specific habitats. Compare those to humans, which live just about everywhere and eat just about anything. So which lifestyle is better, being a generalist or being a specialist? There are pros and cons to each type. A generalist has more competition because they're eating all kinds of different things that other things are eating. But they're also more adaptable to change because of their broad range of diet and habitat needs. Whereas a specialist has very little competition for its requirements, but they're not very adaptable to change. So where these flamingos might eat a very specific diet, if that diet changes at all, they won't be able to change with it. They only can eat certain things. So the question is it better to be a generalist or a specialist species? And I guess it depends on a couple environmental conditions. For example, in the tropical rainforest where the environmental conditions are fairly constant, specialists have a major advantage because they have fewer competitors. Whereas in environments that are often rapidly changing, the generalist is usually better off than the specialist because the specialist can't adapt fast enough to those changing conditions. So within a community or ecosystem, there are 5 kind of especially important types of species or niches. There are the native species, the non-native species, the keystone species, indicator species, and then the foundational species. Any given species may function as more than one of these 5 types in an ecosystem. So a native species may also be a keystone species, or a native species may also be an indicator species. Maybe a non-native species is also a keystone species. So it can function as more than one of these. All right, the first type of species, the native species, are those that normally live in a given area. In the Northwest, we define native species as those that were here when Lewis and Clark first arrived. They have evolved because they've been here longer, along with other native species, and have these intricate connections with them. All right, since humans are able to move, and so are species from place to place, each ecosystem often includes a segment of non-native species. So these are sometimes called alien species. Some non-native species are also referred to as invasive species because of how they've taken over. Not all non-native species are indeed invasive, but some people refer to them as exotic species because they come from somewhere else. They certainly are native somewhere, they're just not native to that particular community. So they've been brought here deliberately. Like most of my garden plants, for instance, my tomatoes and cucumbers are non-native, but we brought them here because they grow these beautiful tomatoes. Or maybe they hitched a ride on something or accidentally were brought here. So a lot of non-native species and some invasive non-native species were brought in the ballast waters of boats and dumped here on shore and just happened to be able to survive. One are these zebra mussels here. You can see this shopping cart must have been at the bottom of one of the Great Lakes, and the Great Lakes have a lot of these non-native zebra mussels that have colonized the area. All right, so non-native species, like I said before, are not always bad for diversity. In fact, most of the crops and livestock are non-native species like those garden plants that I was talking about. Every now and then, non-native species are really bad. In 1957, they brought wild African bees to Brazil to help increase what they thought to increase the honey population or honey production, sorry. Instead, these bees ended up displacing domestic honeybees and they reduced the supply. So they got an opposite outcome than they hoped for. And since then, they have moved north into Central America and they've killed like over 150 people in Mexico since the mid 80s. So it's taken a while for them to migrate. But they've become established in places like Texas and Arizona and New Mexico. And the next slide, I'll show you kind of where they've moved to. And they're now heading north at about 150 miles per year. Hopefully, it's estimated that they'll be stopped by the cold winters. But, you know, they don't have the competition that they have in other places or the predators. Here's showing the spread of these African bees. They're killer bees, as they're known, here throughout the United States, and expected that they're going to migrate north, but their range isn't going to go much further north, likely because of the cold winters. Oftentimes, non-native species just can't possibly survive in this new habitat, especially if they're more specialist species. The new area is just not favorable for their survival. And then there are times when non-native species flourish and they do well in their new environment. The habitat's favorable, they don't outcompete native species. Maybe there was a niche there waiting to be filled and they happen to fill it and coexist with the native species. And then there are those occasions, which we hear about often, where non-native species absolutely take over an area. Often there are no predators for the species, like the killer bees, since it hasn't evolved alongside those in the native range, and it gives those non-native species a competitive advantage or a competitive edge over the native species. And they flourish, take over, and become invasive. This can happen with non-native plants. It can also happen with non-native animals. Okay, so the next different type of species I want to talk about within a community is the indicator species. And these are species that provide ecologists with really an early warning system for damage to an ecosystem. So these species tend to respond to changes in environmental conditions negatively, and they're kind of the red flag. They tell us, oh my gosh, something's happening to this ecosystem that could harm others within it. So they're sort of the canaries in a coal mine. When I'm teaching, there are certain students that if they don't understand a concept, they're kind of my indicator for the rest of the group. If they don't understand it, then likely nobody else is understanding it either. So those are my indicator students, so to speak. Oftentimes birds, especially those that are widespread, are easily affected by environmental damage, and so those become, or chemical pesticides, and so birds are kind of our first to show signs of environmental change or damage, and we look to them as indicator species. The northern spotted owl, which we've already talked about, is an indicator species here in the Northwest for the health of old-growth forests. Another common indicator species are amphibians, and that's because they breathe partially through their skin, so they're really sensitive to changes in things like water quality. So if there's something happening to the newts or the amphibians in an ecosystem, we can pretty well indicate that the water quality is decreasing and it could potentially harm others within that ecosystem. Another type of species, besides indicator, non-native, and native, are the keystone species. And oftentimes native species are keystone species as well. These are species that have a large effect on the number and type of other species within an ecosystem. So keystone species are very well connected to the ecosystem. Many things, if something happens to that keystone species, many other organisms within that community will be impacted. This is a very important concept. So a keystone species, again, is those that impact its community in a larger or greater way than to be expected just by its abundance or its biomass within the environment. Some general examples of keystone species are top predators that feed on and help kind of regulate the size and numbers of other species, and also those pollinators that control the size of plant populations. The big example in the Northwest as a keystone species are salmon. Salmon play a really vital role in the Pacific Northwest ecosystems. In fact, they help support approximately 137 different types of species. From mammals, there are like 41 different types of mammals, birds, 89 different species of birds that rely on salmon, 5 reptiles, and 2 different amphibians. So without salmon as a keystone species, we could see a tremendous decrease in other species. Speaking on that, the effects of losing a specific keystone species, when a keystone species is lost, it leads to population crashes and the extinction of other species. So if the salmon population crashed, we're talking 137 different species would have to find a new niche, likely leading to the potential extinction of those species if they can't find the niche or that connection that they had with the salmon in a different form. All right, the last type of species we're talking about today is the foundation species. They're also known as ecosystem engineers because they play a massive role in creating the ecosystems in which they live. So foundation species are essentially shaping the communities by creating and enhancing habitats in ways that benefit other species. Okay, so something like the African elephants, when they're pushing over trees, they break them, uproot them, they're actually creating forest openings for other plants. And this promotes the growth of grasses and other things. So from the video by Alan Salvage, we saw that that was an important way to help form soils. So in this case, large herding animals are foundation species in grassland areas. I forgot I put this slide in here. Here's my example from the last slide, but again, elephants breaking down small trees in the African savanna, allowing for grass and benefiting other grazers and opening the plains to these predators, and also for soil formation. Another one that folks in the Northwest don't like so much are beavers, which are considered foundational species because they build dams that then create ponds that other species benefit from, especially salmon. Phew! Last slide of the day. So big idea number 6 was that each species plays an important role in its ecosystem. So we know this based on what we've just talked about, but the quick think today is, should we devote more of our budget and our resources to protecting keystone and foundation species, perhaps at the peril of others within an ecosystem? Okay, so instead of putting the endangered, all plants and animals that are threatened on the Endangered Species Act or species list, should we maybe put more of our time and energy to those that are keystone and foundation species and not worry so much about the others that don't play those big roles within an ecosystem? So I want you to answer that question again, the quick thinks on a separate sheet with the others, and explain why you decided either yes, we should protect keystones and foundations more, or why you chose that we should protect them all the same.